On September 30th, 1951, a Navy bomber carrying a 21-year-old soldier crashed off Point Reyes. That soldier was Clint Eastwood. What happened next nearly ended Hollywood's greatest career before it started. The day had started ordinarily enough. Private Clint Eastwood, stationed at Fort Ord in Monterey Bay, California, had spent the weekend in Seattle visiting his parents and his girlfriend. He was 21 years old, 6 months into his Army service during the Korean War, working as a swimming instructor and bouncer at the NCO Club. Hollywood was still years away. Fame was unimaginable. He was just a kid trying to get back to base. In 1951, military personnel could fly for free on available military flights if they wore their uniform. Eastwood showed up at Naval Air Station Seattle on that September afternoon, hoping to catch a ride south to California. The base had one plane heading in his direction. A Douglas AD-1Q Skyraider, a World War II vintage torpedo bomber designed for combat, not passengers. The plane wasn't meant to carry hitchhiking soldiers. It had a pilot seat and a radar operator's compartment where Eastwood would squeeze in for the flight. But free was free, and Fort Ord was several hundred miles south. Eastwood climbed aboard without hesitation. The pilot was Lieutenant Francis Coleman Anderson, a Navy officer heading to Mather Air Force Base in Sacramento. Anderson did a standard pre-flight check, found everything in order, and fired up the single radial engine. Eastwood settled into the cramped radar compartment in the back of the aircraft, and they took off into clear Seattle skies. Within minutes of takeoff, everything started going wrong in the worst possible way. First, the rear hatch wouldn't stay closed. The door kept flying open during flight, forcing Eastwood to jury-rig it shut with wire while the plane was in motion. It was uncomfortable and concerning, but not yet dangerous. Then, the oxygen system failed. At the altitude they were flying, this was a serious problem, but Anderson adjusted their flight path to stay lower where oxygen wasn't as critical. Then, the radios went dead. Communication between Anderson and Eastwood was now impossible. The navigation systems failed next, leaving Anderson flying essentially blind in deteriorating weather conditions. What had started as a routine military transport flight was rapidly becoming a nightmare. As they approached Northern California, the weather turned ugly. Thick gray fog rolled in from the Pacific, reducing visibility to nearly zero. Anderson was navigating by instinct now, trying to find landmarks that would guide him to Sacramento. But in the fog, over unfamiliar terrain, with no working instruments, he was essentially lost. Then came the final, catastrophic failure. The fuel gauge dropped to empty. The Douglas AD-1Q had been burning fuel faster than expected, probably due to one of the many mechanical failures plaguing the flight. Anderson realized with growing horror that they weren't going to make it to Mather Air Force Base. They weren't going to make it to any base. They were running out of fuel over the Pacific Ocean in the gathering dusk. Eastwood, isolated in the radar compartment with no working intercom, didn't fully understand what was happening until he felt the plane's altitude dropping rapidly. Through the small window, he could see nothing but fog and the darkening ocean below. Anderson made the only decision he could. He aimed for the water and prepared to ditch the aircraft. At approximately 5:30 p.m., just off Point Reyes Peninsula north of San Francisco, the Douglas AD-1Q Skyraider hit the Pacific Ocean. The impact was violent, but controlled. Anderson had managed a textbook water landing considering the circumstances. The plane's momentum carried it forward briefly before the ocean began pulling it down. Both men survived the impact. Anderson and Eastwood scrambled out of the sinking aircraft and inflated their emergency life rafts. The plane disappeared beneath the waves within seconds, leaving them alone in the frigid October waters of the Pacific. The situation was dire. The water temperature was brutally cold, probably in the low 50s Fahrenheit. Hypothermia would set in within an hour. The fog was so thick they could barely see each other, let alone the shore. The sun was setting. Nobody knew exactly where they were, and then the ocean separated them. The waves were rough, driven by strong winds. Despite being relatively close initially, Anderson and Eastwood were pushed in different directions by the currents. Eastwood's life raft, smaller and less stable, flipped in a particularly large wave. He fell into the water, grabbing desperately for the raft, but it was swept away from him. Eastwood, was now alone in the Pacific Ocean, without a raft in near freezing water, with night approaching. What happened next would have killed most people. But Eastwood had one advantage that he didn't even fully appreciate at the time: his Army job. For 6 months, Eastwood had been working as a swimming instructor at Fort Ord. He'd obtained his Red Cross lifeguard certification and had spent countless hours in the water teaching soldiers to swim. He was in excellent physical condition, and more importantly, he understood how to conserve energy in water, how to breathe efficiently, and how to fight panic. That training saved his life. Eastwood looked toward the shore and saw lights in the distance. He couldn't tell exactly how far away they were. Later estimates would range from 2 to 4 miles, but they gave him a target. He started swimming. The water was so cold it felt like knives against his skin. Every movement sent shooting pain through his limbs. His uniform, now completely soaked, was heavy and dragged against his movements, pulling him down with every stroke. His muscles began cramping almost immediately from the cold, seizing up in protest. The salt water burned his eyes and throat. But Eastwood had one thought that he repeated to himself like a mantra, over and over with every painful breath. Other people have survived things like this before. If they can do it, I can do it. He didn't allow himself to think about dying. He didn't allow panic to take over. He just kept his eyes on the lights on shore and kept swimming. Stroke after stroke, breath after breath, focusing only on the next movement, the next breath, the next few yards. The distance seemed impossible, but stopping meant death, so he didn't stop. The fog made it difficult to track progress. Sometimes the lights would disappear completely, and Eastwood would have to fight the terror that he'd been swimming in the wrong direction. But then they'd reappear, and he'd adjust his course and keep going. Time lost all meaning. Later, Eastwood would estimate he was in the water for somewhere between 1 and 3 hours, but he honestly couldn't say for certain. It felt like both minutes and days. His world had narrowed to nothing but cold water, burning muscles, and distant lights. What Eastwood didn't know, what he wouldn't learn until many years later, was that he was swimming through one of the prime breeding grounds for great white sharks along the California coast. Point Reyes is known among marine biologists as an area where white sharks gather, particularly in the fall months when Eastwood was in the water. Decades later, when someone told him this fact, Eastwood's response was characteristically understated. I found out many years later that it was a white shark breeding ground, but I'm glad I didn't know that at the time or I'd have just died. The ignorance was a blessing. If Eastwood had known what might be circling beneath him in the dark water, the panic might have overwhelmed him. Instead, he focused only on survival and forward movement. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Eastwood felt something beneath his feet. Sand. He'd reached the shallows. He tried to stand, but his legs, cramped and exhausted from hours of swimming and cold, wouldn't support him. He crawled onto the beach, got past the surf zone, and lay on the sand, unable to move. But he wasn't safe yet. He was soaking wet in near-freezing temperatures, exhausted, and miles from any town or base. He needed to find help before hypothermia finished what the ocean hadn't. After a few minutes of rest, Eastwood forced himself to stand. He could see a bright light in the distance, brighter and more steady than the scattered lights he'd been swimming toward. He started walking toward it, his wet uniform chafing with every step, his body shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. The terrain was rough. He had to navigate past Abbott's Lagoon, climb over a high fence, and cross rough coastal brush in the dark. But the light drew him forward. After what felt like miles of stumbling through the darkness, he reached the source. The KPHRCA ship-to-shore radio receiving station at Point Reyes. There was a single operator on duty that night, working alone in the station. When Eastwood stumbled through the door, soaking wet, shivering violently, and trying to explain that he'd just survived a plane crash and swum miles to shore, the operator initially had trouble understanding what this waterlogged soldier was saying. But Eastwood was persistent. He explained about the plane, about Lieutenant Anderson, about ditching in the ocean. The operator, finally comprehending the situation, immediately called the Coast Guard. Within the hour, Coast Guard personnel arrived and took Eastwood to the Point Reyes lifeboat station. There, he was reunited with Lieutenant Anderson, who'd managed to stay with his life raft and had drifted further north, eventually reaching shore at Kehoe Ranch near Pierce Point. Both men had survived, against incredible odds, with multiple equipment failures, a crash landing in the ocean, separation in shark-infested waters, and hours of exposure to near-freezing temperatures. They had both made it to shore alive. The local newspaper, the Independent Journal, covered the incident. The October 1st, 1951 edition reported, "Two servicemen who battled a thick gray fog and a strong surf for almost an hour last night, following a plane landing in the ocean near the marine shore, are returning to their service units today uninjured." The article identified them as Army Private Clint Eastwood, who wandered into the RCA radio station at Point Reyes after struggling in the ocean, and Naval Lieutenant F.C. Anderson, who landed his life raft on the shore at Kehoe Ranch. For the local paper, it was a minor story. Two servicemen survived a plane crash, no major injuries, everyone goes home. They had no way of knowing that one of those servicemen would become one of the most iconic figures in cinema history. Eastwood returned to Fort Ord and resumed his duties as a swimming instructor. He rarely talked about the crash in those early years. It was just something that had happened, a close call, one of those war stories that soldiers sometimes share but don't dwell on. But the experience left marks, both visible and invisible. Eastwood developed a deep respect for aviation and the ocean. He would later become a licensed pilot himself, flying both fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters, perhaps driven by a need to understand and control the machines that had nearly killed him. The crash also gave him a profound appreciation for survival and resilience. When asked years later what he was thinking during those hours in the water, Eastwood said, "I thought I might die. But then I thought, other people have made it through these things before. I kept my eyes on the lights on shore and kept swimming." That mentality, acknowledge the danger, recognize that survival is possible, focus on the next achievable goal, would become a hallmark of Eastwood's approach to both life and filmmaking. Lieutenant Francis Coleman Anderson, the pilot who saved both their lives with his skilled water landing, was not as fortunate in the long run. On January 29, 1953, just 16 months after the Point Reyes crash, Anderson was declared missing in action over Korea. He was never found. The man who saved Clint Eastwood's life died in another aircraft, in another ocean, fighting a war that Eastwood had narrowly avoided being sent to. The irony was not lost on Eastwood. If the plane hadn't crashed, if he'd made it back to Fort Ord that night without incident, there's a chance he might have been deployed to Korea like many of his fellow soldiers. The crash that nearly killed him may have saved him from a deployment that could have ended his life in a completely different way. Decades later, Eastwood would direct two films that drew directly from his experience that night. In 2010, he directed Hereafter, starring Matt Damon, which opens with a devastating tsunami and near-drowning scene. Eastwood's personal understanding of what it feels like to fight for survival in water brought an authenticity to those scenes that few directors could match. Then, in 2016, Eastwood directed Sully, the story of Captain Chesley Sullenberger's emergency landing of U.S. Airways Flight 1549 in the Hudson River. Tom Hanks, who starred as Sullenberger, later said that Eastwood was the only director who could have made that film. "He almost died," Hanks told reporters. "He almost froze in the water. I mean, no one else but Clint could have or should have made this movie." Eastwood himself acknowledged the connection but downplayed it. "I definitely did think about it when I was shooting this," he said about Sully. "I'm probably the only director who's actually been in a water landing." In 2018, a project was launched to locate the wreckage of the Douglas A D-1Q Skyraider that crashed that September night in 1951. The plane lies somewhere on the ocean floor off Point Reyes, a relic of a moment when Hollywood almost lost one of its greatest talents before the world even knew his name. The story of Clint Eastwood's survival is a reminder that the paths to greatness are often paved with near disasters and close calls. If the plane had crashed 5 miles further out, Eastwood might not have made it to shore. If the water had been 10 degrees colder, hypothermia might have claimed him. If he hadn't been a trained swimming instructor, the distance might have been impossible. But he was where he was, the water was what it was, and he had the training he had. And because of all these factors aligning in his favor, a 21-year-old soldier made it to shore, dried off, went back to teaching swimming at Fort Ord, and eventually became Clint Eastwood. If this incredible true story of survival against impossible odds moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to remember that the difference between tragedy and triumph is often just refusing to give up. Have you ever survived something that seemed impossible? Share your story in the comments. Ring that bell for more true stories about legends whose greatest roles were the ones they played in real life.